Hello everyone, it's Marla here. Happy holidays. Before I get into this week's video, I just wanted to let you know that I will probably skip next week so I can spend time with my family for the holidays. However, this video is packed full of thrift flips as I try to use up some of my stash before the new year. Most of the projects are wood, and it only took paint and transfers to make them absolutely beautiful. Please stick around and see what I did. I grabbed 3 rolling pins and decided to start out with one of them. For project 1, I chose to paint this rolling pin in a beautiful color by Fusion Mineral Paint called Buttermilk Cream. I love the soft yellow tone of this paint and have been waiting to try it. I decided that I wanted a background for the transfers I was putting on, so I'm using an IOD stamp called the Waltz and IOD's China Blue ink. In order to decide how much of the stamp I needed to use, I measured the circumference of the rolling pin and then marked that out on the stamp. After I was done with the stamp, then I went to scraps of transfers that I had not used up yet and decided to pull several of those for this rolling pin. I really wanted it to have a floral, botanical feel because that is one of my favorite decor designs. Once I had picked out the transfers I wanted to use, I started applying them using a transfer stick. As you can probably see on this transfer, there are a lot of little branches and tiny flowers, and so I really had to take my time in getting them all down on the rolling pin. Once you get the transfer down, it's important to go back and burnish it with the carrier sheet. I continued on with this process until I had all of the transfers on the rolling pin, and I liked the way that it looked. As you can see, I started out with 2 larger transfers, and then I decided to go back in and fill the empty spaces with smaller transfers of flowers and butterflies. After I was finished with all of the transfers, I sealed them in with a coat of DIY's liquid patina. I then decided to paint the handles. I chose a blue that was similar to a blue in the transfers, knowing that it would be a little bit darker after I distressed it. However, it seems that I did the distressing off camera. I just used Fusion's Antiquing Glaze. Please let me know what you think of the rolling pin in the comments. Do you like the yellow? For project 2, I grabbed 2 small cast iron griddles that I had picked up a long time ago at a thrift store. I actually picked up 3, but I'm only using 2 for this project. I decided that I wanted to paint the bottom of them with milk paint, and so I'm using Sweet Pickins milk paint in the color Creamy. And I will apply 2 coats, hoping to get a little bit of crazing and maybe even some chipping. After the paint had dried, I went in with my 2-finger sander to even out the edges and then to remove any bumps of milk paint from the surface and to bring out any chipping paint if there was paint that was going to chip. Initially, I didn't really get a lot of chipping, and so I decided that I would put my transfers directly on the milk paint, which you'll see later did cause some of the paint to come off, but not too much. I actually liked the way it turned out in the end. For the first transfer, I'm using a transfer of a bird in a nest that came from one of IOD's holiday releases. I wanted to use something that would easily go into the winter season and could be used for home decor after Christmas. As you can tell right there, I was looking behind the transfer sheet to see if the paint was coming up with the transfer. And as I said, some of it did in a few areas, but it didn't hurt the transfer at all. I got as much of the picture on there as I wanted. In fact, you can see the spots where some of the paint did come off, but I like the way it looks. I did use sandpaper again to go over those areas just to make sure that everything that was chippy came off before I put a coat of DIY Big Top over the transfer. For the second griddle, I decided to use this Christmas tree. Although it really just looks like a pine tree, there are no decorations on it of any kind. Again, something that is going to look great during the winter season. I had planned for both of these to be wall hangers for the kitchen. After the Big Top had dried, then I went in with my vintage aging paste or antiquing paste and went around the edges to give it a nice vintage look. I like this paste because you can add and subtract as needed, although sometimes if you wait too long, you have to get out another wax to get it to come off. But it gives it a nice patina, a beautiful vintage look. As you can see for this one, I added a little bit of festive ribbon at the top. And then I turned my attention to the other griddle, aging it the same way that I had the first one, and then chose some different ribbons to put on this one. I went with a nice pale green and a little bit of lace. I like the way that both of them turned out. You'll have to let me know in the comments if this is something that you would hang in your kitchen. For project 3, I'm using a rustic wooden bowl that I purchased many, many years ago. I think I picked it up at Home Goods, I'm not sure, but I have been using it in my decor for probably more than 5 years. I decided that it was time for the bowl to have a bit of a fresh new look. I didn't want to change it a lot, but I did want to update it and do something different for my decor. I started out by giving the bottom of the bowl 2 coats of the creamy milk paint I had left over from the cast iron griddles. After the paint had dried, I then took sandpaper and sanded it using quite a bit of pressure to get off any chipping paint. And I did get quite a bit on one side, a little bit on the other. I continued sanding it until I felt like all of the paint that was going to chip off had chipped off. When I was done with the bottom, I turned the bowl over and gave the inside of the bowl a light sanding as well. Since milk paint has to be sealed, I chose to use Sweet Pickens dark oil wax to seal the bowl. I love the finish that it gives. It does bring out the cracking and the crazing, which is the primary reason I use milk paint. I love all the crazing and the chippiness you get from it. I let the oil wax set on the bowl for about 20 minutes and then took a soft towel to wipe it off. I have never used the bowl for food or anything like that, and so I thought it would be perfectly fine to go ahead and put a transfer on the inside. I love this transfer. It's a beautiful transfer of a red cabbage. Again, it has that very botanical look that I like. Now, because the bowl swoops down in the middle, I did have to go around and make some cuts in the transfer to get it to lay down. And hopefully it would go on smoothly and I wouldn't get a lot of cracking, which sometimes happens when you use a transfer over a rounded surface. There were a few spots where I had to take a little extra care getting the transfer down, and I do think I lost half of a berry, but the transfer was still beautiful. I just used my fingernail to pull away the half of the berry that managed to stick to the bowl. After getting all of the transfer down, I then went over it with a coat of DIY's liquid patina. I really love the way the bowl turned out, and now I'm wondering, why didn't I do this sooner? For project 4, I'm using a cutting board or pizza board. I'm not sure which it is, but it looks more like a pizza pail to me. Anyway, I picked this up in a thrift store. A little bit of an odd shape, but I love upcycling wood, so I grabbed it. I'm giving it a coat of DIY's White Swan to use as the base for my transfers. It didn't really matter to me if I got the entire board covered because I like a distressed look. I just needed enough down for my transfers to pop. Once again, I'm going with a very botanical theme. I love plants, flowers, birds, everything to do with the outdoors. And IOD has a transfer book called Menagerie that just fits the bill. It is one of the most beautiful transfer books I think they have ever come out with all of the florals, the tree branches, the birds, even the bird cages. You can do some amazing things with this transfer. I wanted my flowers to be behind the bird cage, and so I took a little time to figure out where to position it, how to position it, so that the majority would be in the background of the cage. I also wanted to make sure that it looked like the cage was hanging from that branch, so I did a little bit of detective work ahead of time to make sure that I had placed the branch in the right place as well. Since I had the bird cage, I knew I wanted a bird as well, but I didn't want him to be confined inside the cage. So I found this beautiful bird from that transfer book who's outside sitting on a branch near his cage. After these main elements were on, I just went through the book and continued to pull out florals and branches until I got an image that I was happy with. And another thing that I really like about this transfer is it's easy to cut the pieces apart and use them to fit the project that you're doing. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. For project 5, I grabbed a wooden spoon and fork that I had picked up in a little thrift store in California and decided to give them an upcycle as well. Green is one of my favorite colors, and so I decided that I was going to paint the spoons green. And I wanted to paint them in Debbie's DIY clay paint because I knew it would be very easy to do a wet distress. I got out my heat gun to speed up the drying process because I wanted to get to painting the edges of the spoon and the fork. And DIY paint dries very quickly since it is a clay paint. However, you might notice that when you dry it, the color is much lighter than what it's actually going to be when you put a finish on top of it. For this project, I pulled out a transfer book that I have never used. In fact, it was just recently that I bought it. It's called Millow's Pages. It's full of mushrooms and botanicals. It also has bugs and butterflies. There are just, it seems like a zillion transfers here that you can use. And I know that mushrooms have been very popular. And I also remember the avocado green decorated in mushroom canisters, cups, sort of thing that my mother had back in the 1970s in her kitchen. And so this is kind of a nod back to that era. To determine which of the transfers I wanted to use, I actually laid the spoon down on top of the transfers to see which ones would fit. I cut out several, ended up going with mushrooms on both the spoon and the fork. After I had finished with the spoon part, I decided that I would add some florals to the handle on the spoon. And so I went back to Millow's Pages and tried to find florals that not only fit next to the mushrooms, but would fit along the handles as well. I repeated the same process with the fork, adding mushrooms to the spoon part of it, and florals along the mushrooms as well as on the handle. After I was done with the transfers, I used a wet wipe to go back and distress the edges before sealing both the fork and the spoon in with a coat of DIY Big Top. I like the way they turned out, and they really do take me back to the 70s. For Project 6, I got out the other two rolling pins that I had brought with me and decided that I would upcycle them for Christmas. I've always wanted a rolling pin that had Santa on it, something that was very festive to stick in one of my large mixing bowls on display, and so I thought this is the perfect time to do it. I pulled out one of my favorite IOD transfers. This book was from last year or the year before. I honestly can't remember which, but it has a beautiful Santa, and he fit almost perfectly on this rolling pin. I had given the rolling pin a coat of DIY White Swan as the base again. I find that the transfers go onto the DIY paint just fine without having to seal it in first. There was a bit of a gap on the back of the rolling pin where the two sides of the Santa almost met, but not quite. And so I went into my transfer books and I found this garland that fit perfectly right down the middle between the two sides of the transfer. I then went back and added little bits and pieces, a gold snowflake here or there, or a gold star to fill out the rolling pin. Once I was done putting on all the transfers, Then I had to give them a top coat to seal them in, and then decided on this particular rolling pin I would paint the handle black. I thought about red, but I felt like with the transfer that I used, black looked better, and you'll see in the next rolling pin that I use red on it anyway. After the paint on the handles had dried, I went back with my finger sander and I started to distress not only the handles, but I did some distressing on the rolling pin as well. After I had everything distressed back the way I wanted it, I got out my Fusion antiquing glaze and went over the rolling pin and the handles, dabbing back the excess with a soft towel. As a final touch, I used my antiquing paste to go around the wood at both ends of the rolling pin, again trying to make it look old and distressed. Give it a nice vintage look. The last rolling pin I had was much smaller than the other two and already had a dark base to work with, so this was an easy upcycle. I cleaned the rolling pin and then I went into my transfers and I found 2 transfers of Christmas stockings that were the perfect size for this rolling pin. So I put one on each side. I gave the rolling pin a coat of Big Top to seal in the transfers just as I had done before, and then I got out the red paint to paint the handles. I thought it would make the stockings pop, and it did. Here I'm using DIY's Carnival Red, which is a perfect color for Christmas. I finished this rolling pin by giving it a coat of Fusion's antiquing glaze so that I would get that distressed or vintage look in the handles. I hope you like how these turned out. I absolutely love them. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for sticking with me till the end. I hope you like the projects that I made. I actually made more than I normally do for a video, but that's partly because I'm not sure there will be a video next Tuesday. I plan to spend the next few days with my family and enjoy the holidays. And with that, I hope that you and your family have a wonderful holiday season as well. And if not next week, I will see you the week after.